Hi, folks. Welcome to Peace at Home Parenting. I'm Ruth Freeman, licensed clinical social worker and founder of Peace at Home. We're talking today about your role in your children's therapy, or even if you're thinking about therapy for your kids, we'll have some ideas about that. And I'm very delighted to be here with Mary Ann Barton. And Mary Ann, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and tell folks a little bit about you.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. It's great to be here with you. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm also the director of the Psychological Services Clinic at the University of Connecticut, which is a training program that's part of our graduate program in clinical psychology. I'm also the director of clinical training for the Department of Psychological Sciences, so I'm heavily involved in training. Clinically, my interests are in childhood, early childhood, parenting, and in the identification of children and young adults with autistic spectrum disorders.
You did that quick, Mary Ann.
Okay. I guess I could slow down.
No, I'm glad you're getting it across. So let's get started today. After this session, our participants will be able to think about how to know if your child needs therapy, if that's still a question in your mind. You'll have some ideas about how to choose a therapist and what's your role in setting goals for therapy with your child. And what's your role in the treatment altogether? And this varies by age, of course. And how do we know if therapy is working? And finally, at the end of this class, we're going to be asking you, what's going to be your first action step? You're going to hear a lot of ideas here. And I want to remind you all that this is an interactive class. You can raise your hand at any time and we'll get to you as soon as we can. You can post chats to just the facilitators, or you can post chats to the whole group, and we will respond to those as soon as we can. The class gets much more interesting and important for every participant when you really share what's going on for you and ask your questions and send your comments. So we're going to start with a little poll because we want to know who's here. And we're asking you what brought you to today's class. Maybe you're thinking about therapy for your child, but you're not sure. Maybe you want to know how to be helpful to your child who's already in therapy. Maybe you're uncertain if your child's therapist is being helpful. Maybe your child is in therapy, but you're really not seeing much progress towards what you were hoping would happen. Or maybe you just don't like your child's therapist and need a little guidance on how to handle that, because if your child is connecting and you're seeing progress, you're going to want to stick with that. Rosanna, we're going to be with you in a second. So give us another minute and we'll see what's happening for our participants. And it looks like about half of us are really unsure. Our kids aren't in therapy yet, but this class will be helpful to you. And then almost half of us want to know how to be helpful. And a small percentage of us aren't even sure that the therapy is being helpful. So thank you very much. Wherever you are, you're not alone here. I think I thought there was a raised hand, but maybe not. Let me see if there's a chat question. Oh, so we have one parent here that just wants to continue their education as a parent, and if you have other, so we have a couple of folks who are just interested in this topic. If you have other reasons for being here, please put it into the chat. That will be helpful.
Okay. So I think we're ready to start talking about how we decide when it's time to think about therapy for a child. And clearly, children develop in very different ways and respond to stressors in their life in very different ways. So I think we have some children who withdraw a little bit, spend more time alone. I saw a child who used to go out and sit on a large rock in their backyard and just sort things out a little bit. And then I think we have other children for whom the first sign of stress is a real change in behavior, more acting out, more difficulties with emotional regulation. And I think children experience a wide range of stressors, many of which are transient and part of normative development. And we might see these kinds of disruptions in behavior for a few days or for a few weeks. And I think often parents can recognize these signs in their kids, point them out to children, label them, and basically model for them that talking can help some of these things. Sometimes parents will say to a child, it helps me when I talk to someone about things I'm worried about or things that are make me feel unhappy. And are there things that are happening for you that we could talk about a little bit? So I think this is all part of a normative process. But sometimes, obviously, children need more help than that. I think when we see children who are experiencing stressors that are not normative, who might be experiencing a significant loss, for example, or a major disruption in family functioning. And when we think about those disruptions, we think about difficult things like divorce, but it can also be an older sibling going off to school somewhere that kids experience as a loss. But I think when we see these, and of course, we think about trauma in the same sort of more significant stressor. I think when we see these difficulties, we see children having emotional regulation and therefore behavioral regulation problems. And I think children often cannot label the emotions that they're feeling. They can't tell you what's distressing them, but you know from their behavior, they have a much shorter fuse. They are much quicker to have meltdowns. They don't recover as quickly. And these difficulties go on for more than a few weeks and are in response to more than a normative kind of stress. I think one of the other things we often see is, we will often see children who are stressed at school, for example, are doing perfectly well at school, but when they come home, we parents see what really is troubling them. And that's normative. That's an example of children misbehaving in their safe space so that they can get the support that they need. But when we see children having problems in more than one setting, struggling in school, struggling with peers, or having behavioral difficulties that are really getting in the way of things that they used to be able to do comfortably, then I think we have a greater cause for concern.
Go ahead, Mary.
Go ahead.
One thing I just want to note is that your kids. So when you start to see these changes, trust your gut. If this looks like, wow, this is more than usual, this is a lot. I think that's, and also very important for parents of kids all the way through adolescence, that kids' behavior is telling us a story that they don't always have words for. And I think Marianne has referred to this a few times about learning to try to look behind the behavior and understand it.
Right, exactly. So if you decide that perhaps your child's difficulties are more than you might anticipate and that it's time to think about a therapist, becomes a challenge to find one and to choose the right one. I think we always start out by asking people that we trust, people who might have had experience with local professionals. I think we always encourage people to find a licensed professional, a social worker, a psychologist, a professional counselor. If the issue is more family-based, a marriage and family therapist, perhaps. But the important thing, I think, is that you find someone whose skills are appropriate to the difficulty that you think your child is presenting. So if this is a family concern, you probably want to see someone with skills in family therapy and systemic family therapy. If your child appears anxious or depressed, you want someone with experience working with children with those kinds of difficulties. And of course, the same is true with behavior problems. Behavior problems are going to take a multiple of approaches to begin to address them for the child, and also in terms of the family response to those difficulties.
Marianne, we have a raised hand that I'm going to catch right now.
Okay.
Rosanna, I think you can unmute yourself.
Hi, hello, I'm Rosanna's husband. I've actually got a question. What about when the state officials and therapists are the cause of the children's attitude, depression, and misbehaving actions?
So you're feeling like the therapist himself is the cause of the difficulties?
I've been through it myself. I have seen it happen firsthand, and yeah, I've got a 4-year-old right now that's actually going through the same thing. Because a lot of therapists, like in the state of Tennessee, they have a bad habit of blaming the mother or the father or both, when in all reality, neither parent is the cause of the problem. It is a different problem that the therapist that the child is seeing is actually trying to make them believe that it's going on.
Well, we're going to talk in a few minutes about what to do or if you really are uncomfortable with the therapist that your child is seeing. I think some of what you're describing indeed sounds problematic. I think we don't typically want to take a blaming approach. We want to take a emotionally supportive and problem-solving approach. If that's not something that's available with the therapist with whom you're currently working, I would see about trying to find another therapist with whom you feel more comfortable. We're going to talk a little bit about using empirically supported methods as well. And that's very important because I think there are some therapists who don't necessarily use methods that have been supported by research. At the same time, the most critical piece of any therapy is the relationship between the client and the therapist. And in the case of children, the relationship between the parents and the family, as well as the child and the therapist. It has to be a trusting space where people are comfortable being vulnerable. If it's not, it will not be helpful.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to let someone else ask another quick question, but we got to move along. Mary, go ahead.
Okay, I just had one question about my child's therapy. She's been going through this particular children's center for a while now. And when COVID has started, the services have stopped and everything. So my thing is like getting her back restarted with the same services. With the same services that she had in the past, but they're not understanding. It's like, I don't see, like they can't check her notes or anything to see what services she was all in the past, or how does that work?
That's a good question. If you give your consent, therapists should be able to access the notes of a previous therapist. I think in the pandemic, things got very atypical and people kept notes in unusual ways, but those notes and information should be accessible to you and to your new therapist if you sign a release for that information to be transferred.
So I just want to say, someone was saying that they're going through a divorce and they're taking this class to see if the child needs therapy. I want to just emphasize that even when children have big losses, unless we see symptoms, unless we see something, there's no need to pathologize it or make it, just because you went through a divorce or just because, I used to work at a program that supported children who had a death in their immediate family, a parent or a sibling. Just because you go through that, you grieve, but that isn't necessarily a symptom. So we're looking at what we might call typical or healthy grieving or feeling sad, or we're looking at behaviors that get in the way of children developing positively. And that's kind of the distinction. Why don't you keep going, Mary Ann?
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how we might choose a therapist. And I mentioned earlier the idea of using evidence-based practice. We know there are a number of strategies that have been proven helpful to children and families. Strategies like cognitive behavior therapy, strategies like family therapy, systemic family therapy. And I think it's very important when you choose a therapist that you ask them, what is the approach that they will take? They should be able to explain it to you in a way that makes sense and that a way that allows you to understand what it is that they're doing in the context of the therapy sessions. Obviously, it should be focused on families. We cannot treat children without involving their families. Children simply can't function in completely apart from their families. So it's very important that it be a family-focused method. It's very important that the therapist respect a child's cultural background, religious beliefs, religious practices, and find space for those to be acknowledged and used in the context of the therapy. I think we clearly want the therapy to be inclusive. We want both parents and any other important caregivers to be a part of it. If grandparents are involved, if there's a teacher who's particularly important, therapists get enormously valuable information from talking with some of those people. So I think we want to make this an open process that feels supportive to the entire family and that allows us to engage the family in supporting this child as they cope with their difficulties.
And also you have mentioned here, the therapist has experience with this. If your child has ADHD and this is really getting in the way of school and there's lots of disruptions in school, you want to know this child understands that diagnosis, has treated other kids, and can describe the ways they're doing it and the outcomes they get.
Okay. So that brings us to some questions to ask a potential therapist, beginning with what Ruth just mentioned exactly what is your experience treating this kind of problem, working with a child of this age, working with this kind of difficulty. And what have you found to be helpful in that treatment process that might be helpful to my particular child? I think we want to know clearly, what are the expectations of parents? There are some treatment models that have parents present for every session, learning the strategies that children are being taught, and then really working to coach some of those strategies in the home and to give the children practice. That's a very useful model for some kinds of difficulties, including, for example, anxiety and sometimes depression. And it's more helpful with younger children. It's not always the best plan with adolescents. And in that case, I think we want to have a clear conversation with the therapist about how will parents be involved? Will the therapist meet with them separately? Will the therapist talk with the child about how much information will be shared and when it will be shared with parents? I think we clearly want a therapist who will develop behavior or relationship plans for parents to try at home, to help children both develop a different understanding of what they're experiencing, a new vocabulary to think about their emotions, but also to practice new skills. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those skills might be as we move through this. But I think it's very important that therapy is not a mystery to parents, that parents have an understanding of how this process is going to work and how and why it might be beneficial for a particular child.
And how it's going.
Well, yes. Certainly, I think we're going to talk a little bit about parents' involvement in the therapy process. But I do want to say before we go there that taking a child to therapy is stressful. I think many parents experience it as some sort of indication that something has not gone well, or that perhaps they have not done what they should have done. And that's not generally the case. I think generally children are reacting to stressors in ways that they don't fully understand, and that we as parents don't necessarily know how to respond to. But feeling anxious or uncomfortable about starting that process is completely normal. And I think it's helpful to just find ways to tolerate a little bit about that, a little bit of that. It should get better over time. If you are 3 months into therapy and still feeling anxious and uncomfortable, that's a sign that you may not have the relationship with a therapist that would really be supportive of the treatment. What does that relationship look like? For me, I think it means that you and your child feel like you can talk to a therapist, that they will listen, that they understand what you are trying to communicate to them, and that they will offer some strategies for things that might be helpful. And those strategies can take a wide variety of approaches, but I think it's very important that therapists take an active approach. It's important that everyone feels that this is a relationship that can be trusted, which is why it's important to talk a little bit in advance about confidentiality and what information will be shared, so that people can really feel comfortable examining their own thoughts and feelings and sharing them. There's a lot of data about what kinds of therapy are important, but the most compelling data we have says that it is the relationship. This is true between children and their therapists, between adults and their therapists. The relationship between the therapist and the client is the single most important component of the treatment. So if that does not feel good, I think you want to think about that.
Thank you, Marianne. I want to let everybody know, if you need documentation that you've attended this class, just email us at solutions@peaceathomeparenting.com. And Marianne, we had a question from someone who said her 13-year-old son is in therapy because of a very contentious divorce, and dad is now sort of talking therapy down. And even though the 13-year-old says he likes the therapist now, with dad as a role model, he's kind of saying he's pushing back against therapy. And mom is sort of, mom's trying to support therapy, but I think there's a triangle here. So do you have any thoughts about how mom can navigate that?
Well, I think this is something that the therapist should be discussing with the child, and with the child and the mother together. I think if you can articulate some of the goals for why it's important to be in therapy, acknowledge that dad may feel differently about this, but that this is really not a battle between mom and dad. this is an opportunity for the child to address some difficulties and to address some goals. And I think it's very important that the therapist directly discuss those struggles and the child's ambivalence, particularly in a high conflict situation, and try to make therapy a conflict-free sphere.
And hopefully this therapist has reached out to dad and
Yes.
is willing to have a conversation with the son and dad. And mom and son both have to be very clear why the child's in therapy.
Right.
Just because the parents are having a contentious divorce is not in and of itself a reason for the child to be in therapy. So when Marianne said, make sure everybody's clear about what the goals are, let's say this child is having, this 13-year-old is having big, huge blowouts and isn't able to calm himself and is being disrespectful in the home, and it's happening chronically. So let's say he's showing his stressors that way. That's a very specific goal that you might be having, that he can learn to manage his behavior, so at least he can stay calm or walk away and stay relatively respectful. And once that goal is reached, it's fair for him to say, this is what we talked about, and I'm here, and I don't think I need therapy anymore. Now, mom may sense that he's kind of down or that he's having a hard time, but we can't keep our kids in therapy to make them perfect.
Right.
And I think this is one of those negotiations that we have to be clear about.
Mhm.
Any other questions or comments? Oh, and we have the email address in the chat if anybody's looking for it. Okay. Thanks, Marianne.
Okay.
So when you think about taking your child to therapy, what comes up for you? What are you feeling grateful that you have an opportunity? Are you feeling relieved that someone's going to help you with this difficulty? Do you start to feel uncomfortable? As Marianne said, is very common for when folks start. Do you feel anxious about it, or do you feel embarrassed or ashamed, like somehow I must have failed because my child's in therapy? That common reaction that Marianne described. What comes up for you as you think about having your child in therapy, or just taking your child to therapy, even if you're already there? So it looks about almost half of us are grateful, and I'm glad to hear that, because it means you probably have pretty good therapists working with your kids. And then about a third of us are anxious, which is totally understandable. And then we all small number of us are feeling all of the feelings. So whichever of these feelings you are feeling, you have some other parents here who are with us. Thank you. And they're all normal. So let's talk a little bit about getting started and maybe just talking with your child about therapy. One thing that's important is to just talk about it in a relaxed manner, like this is normal. And we want you to be this way with all of your child's feelings. We want you to just be present and curious and open. And I think it's best when we talk to our kids about, we're going to solve this problem. And you want to be very specific about why. So, I've noticed that you're just not as excited about seeing your friends the way you used to be. I noticed that you're not loving basketball the way you used to. You seem to want to stay home instead. And you seem a little down. And, I hope we can find out what's contributing to that. Let's try to figure that out together. You really want to emphasize that this is a process together. And while this child will have some private time with a therapist and they don't have to tell you everything they're talking about, you're going to be part of the process and you're going to learn also. And you can ask the child, what would they want to get from therapy? What I'm observing in you is this, but when you think about talking to a therapist, what do you think you might want to talk about them with? What kind of goals do you think you want to achieve in therapy? And be very clear that this is not a punishment for negative behavior. It's finding a solution together. And encourage your child to ask questions of the therapist, encourage your child to ask you questions about therapy, and make sure that you reflect their responses and say, oh, so it sounds like you feel a little hurt that I'm talking about therapy. It seems like you feel a little confused about how it works. Just reflect their emotions and check for understanding. If they explain something to you, make sure you're seeing it from their point of view. This conversation should not be about shaping how they see the world. It's about listening to how they see the world and tuning into that. When we talk about attachment, it's safe, soothed, and secure. And that seen part can be very challenging for those of us who are uncomfortable with negative emotions or who are trying to build the perfect kid. And before you start, you want to expect the therapist to explain to both of you that the information in the session is confidential and will not be shared without the parent saying okay, like sharing it with the child's physician or the child's teacher for some reason. And the therapist needs to say clearly to you that if they perceive your child is in danger, if you tell them that, well, the father leaves our 10-year-old alone for several hours at a time, they are obligated to make a report. They can include you in that report. They can, you know, say that I've told the parent and this is how the parent's reacting, but they are legally obligated to make a report to protective services. And as kids get older, there'll be probably less exact content of the conversation shared. And that should be clear when you're talking to the therapist and the child together. And they should be clear about what the cost of the treatment is and how payment works. Is there anything else that the therapist should be explaining, Marianne?
Other than clear goals and what will be the process.
Yeah. So, you want to invite your child to make a list of what they're concerned about and make sure that you understand that from their point of view. It's helpful to bring your goals to the first session. And if appropriate, you discuss them with the child there. Sometimes parents feel more comfortable describing children's behavior because it might be kind of negative or critical. And some therapists may want to see the parent without the child, but sometimes it can be together. And you need to be ready to understand that the therapist is going to ask a lot of questions to understand how you see your child's behavior. And when I see parents, I actually ask about their childhoods right up front, because often our own childhood histories, our parents, our grandparents are contributing to difficulties that we can't see. They're just historical patterns. And therapists may help you to see your child's behaviors or your concerns in a different way. They may actually say, that's kind of normal for a 5-year-old. That isn't so unusual. So you may not have to be concerned about that. Or that angry, destructive behavior may have fear underneath it. They may have you seeing things differently. But it's important ultimately that the therapist, the child, and the parents are on the same page about why are we in therapy here and how will we know when therapy is done? That's a really important question. How will we know when therapy is done? And you really want to be able to be very specific about this. So, for example, if you have a child who's extremely oppositional and just doesn't follow directions at all, you want to say, well, if he's following directions 50% of the time, we're going to call that success. That's good enough. We don't need a perfect child. We don't have to keep this child in therapy until they're, doing everything we want first time we ask. And you also want to talk about what's progress going to look like. So maybe he's not following directions, but he's a whole lot calmer. That would be progress. And you want to agree on a timetable. You don't want your child in therapy for years and years unless there's a good reason for it. And you want to have some regular check-in times. Let's parent and therapist and child, or parent and therapist, let's check in once a month and talk about progress. And this might be the hardest part. When children are in therapy, parents should expect that they probably will have learning goals as well. This isn't, dropping your child off for an oil change, as Marianne sometimes says. It's a process of you understanding your child better, your child understanding themselves better, and you looking at different ways of responding to your child's behavior. And this is as much an art as it is a science, but there's lots of science behind it. Any questions or comments? Marianne, did I leave anything out?
I don't think so.
You can raise your hand. Okay, so we have a question. Okay, either Rosanna or Rosanna's husband, go ahead.
You made the statement that you guys don't recommend that children be in therapy for long periods of time, but what kind of situation, if a child has experienced multiple post-traumatic experiences, why wouldn't they need therapy for long periods of time? Because I've been in therapy myself on and off since I was 9 years old. And I am
Yes,
currently 29 years old.
And when there's intergenerational trauma, so you've probably had trauma, maybe your parents have had trauma, then
Yes.
it's certainly possible that
Or what if they have a
child-
genetic hereditary disorder that, like bipolar mania depression or bipolar schizophrenia, that
right.
they need that extra professional help.
That's right. That's right. There are definitely exceptions to that rule. We don't want kids in therapy if we're not seeing symptoms. Even if a child has had trauma, if you're not seeing symptoms right now, sometimes you take a break from therapy. You know, if the child's doing well, it's like we know their history, so we think they need help. But if the child, I have a foster son who is phenomenally resilient. And if you know his story, you just want to, your heart breaks. But he's a major in the Army. He's flying helicopters. He has kids and a wife. He's doing great. And sometimes he definitely looks to me like he needs some therapy. But we really have to go by what the child is presenting. It's not the diagnosis that drives, and Marianne, please correct me, but it's not the diagnosis that drives the treatment. It's what we're seeing in the child. So even if you have a child with intergenerational trauma and many traumas themselves and a big diagnosis, maybe they have a very major diagnosis, but if they're doing okay in school, they have a couple of friends and they're getting along at home, you might take a break from therapy. Any other comments about that, Marianne?
No, I think the one thing I would add to that is that even when you have a major diagnosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, your goal of treatment is not to eradicate that. Your goal is to make the symptoms less problematic for the child. So that might help him manage his emotional lability a little bit better. And I just think it's very important that we have those goals and we know what they are so that we can say, actually, he's doing a lot better. He's not having as many meltdowns. This might be a time to take a break.
Thank you. And there's when children have these major diagnoses, it's a loss for parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the hardest parts about this is the loss of your dream of your child. So we always have a dream of our child. And then when our child is struggling with some of these diagnoses, it's like we want to take it away from them. We want to take away the struggle. We want to take away the pain. But if your child is doing okay and they just aren't looking like your ideal version of your child, you're not necessarily needing to keep them in therapy. It's not a lifelong commitment. So I just want to check in with you all. We've been talking a lot about goals for therapy. So tell us if you're clear about your child's goals. Perhaps your child isn't in therapy yet, or the therapist and you have goals, but maybe you haven't told the child the goals, which I guess sometimes that's okay, but mostly I think of that as not ideal. Maybe the child has goals with the therapist, but you don't know them. I hear that from parents all the time. They say, oh, the therapist knows what the goals are. Or maybe you both have goals that you have set with the therapist, or maybe your situation's different. And if that's the case, send us in the chat and tell us. So about half of us are saying our situation is different than these. A third of us say that the therapist and the parent have goals, but the child doesn't know them. And do you have any thoughts about that, Marianne?
I think that's problematic. I think this is the kind of situation where we run into kids who don't want to be in therapy and don't see why they have to be in therapy. So I think it's very important that the child does understand, at a developmentally appropriate level, why they are in therapy and what we expect to accomplish with the process.
And the therapist should be able to help you articulate this in a way without blame.
Right.
It may not be easy for parents. And we have a few folks who the child has goals with the therapist, but the parent doesn't know that. We hope you'll change this after that. But if your situation is different, please let us know. Great. Thank you for your candid responses. So Marianne's going to talk about your role in therapy.
Okay. So after about 3 sessions into therapy, you really ought to have some understanding of what's going on. I think in our clinic, we take 3 sessions, we collect a lot of information, we meet with parents, we meet with children, and then we spend a session saying, this is what I think is going on. This is what I think might be causing the child's difficulties, and this is how I think we can help with it. So we want to be very clear and explicit about what the treatment is going to look like, how often we want to see the child, how often we want to see the parents or the rest of the family, what we are going to ask of parents. Are we going to ask them to observe some sessions, to be part of sessions, to practice skills at home? So we really want, after the third session, everyone to be on the same page and to understand what this process is going to look like, and also to understand when we would expect to see some changes. And we might not be able to remediate difficulties altogether, make everything perfect. That's never our goal. Our goal is to make things better. And I think, the last point here, it is always okay to ask questions. You should be asking questions of your therapist until you are really on the same page and you fully understand what they are attempting to do. Somebody posted a question, what's the image of an ideal child? You're exactly right. There is no image of an ideal child. I think part of the task of parenthood is to come to a middle ground between the child that we have in front of us, who has their own ideas and their own affect regulation strategies and their own temperament, and what we might have expected. And I think there's a lot of research that suggests parents go into parenting with expectations about their children that they may not even be aware of. And so I think we want to convey to parents that this is a process of discovering who this child is, and that our job is to facilitate this child being the best that they can be, but not being any ideal that we have in mind for them.
And I think, as Marianne pointed out, some of this can be unconscious.
Mhm.
We try to shape our kids, and there's actually a whole book called The Gardener versus the Carpenter, and it's are we trying to build the child that we want them to be, or are we creating that ground for them to blossom into who they are? And I think one of the biggest challenges of parenting is to stay open and curious. And I have a daughter who was, as a kid, very precocious and very smart and loved math and all that, and she loved sports, she loved math, and she just didn't really enjoy reading. She loved to be read to, but she never really enjoyed reading. And it was a loss for me. I was like, I always thought everybody in our family reads, but she'd rather be outside running around. And there's little losses. We all have these little losses that our child is different than we thought. And I think it's navigating those, and just me going to her basketball games and saying, okay, this is her love. And she played basketball. She played 3-on-3 against her husband on the day they got married, the morning they got married, and it's brought her so much joy. And I just have to enter into that joy. That's who she blossomed into. It wasn't what I thought was going to happen.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Marianne.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about your role in the child's therapy. And this is going to vary a lot. Sometimes the entire family is involved. Therapists will ask other children, all members of the family, how they see the difficulty. And they may suggest changes to the family structure, the way parents interact with children. I think sometimes we interact with kids in ways that we are not fully aware of. So I think one thing that I see often, and that I have experienced myself, is that when we see a child who's struggling, we like to fix it. So we would like to say to a child, well, try X, Y, and Z, and I think you'll feel better. When in fact, often what children need from us is to sit with them and to say, tell me more about how that feels. I'm sorry that you're distressed. If we can do that, if we can sit with that discomfort, which is very, very hard. My children are adults, and I would like to be able to fix all the problems in their lives. But I can't do that. But I think if we can sit with that discomfort, that creates space for kids to be able to think about solving their own problems. And we can be a supportive presence. And that's really what we want to do. But that is really hard as a parent, I think. And I think it gets into one of the last things on this slide, is that we as parents are always responsible for helping children navigate their difficulties. that does not mean that the parent-child relationship created those difficulties. It is always going to be a source of support, or it's going to try to be, and we are always going to be the people that kids are going to turn to for help, even when the problems are not of our creation. And I think our culture tends to blame parents, especially moms, for causing all kinds of difficulties. And that's not terribly helpful. I think it's much more helpful to step back and say, how can I support this child in making some changes in their behavior?
And see yourself as innocent, come to this as innocent in your parent role, even if some way if the therapist identifies that you're contributing somehow, that you're very anxious and the child feels anxious too in response to your anxiety, you're innocent, you're doing your very best, and this is going to be a learning experience for both of you. You don't want to take this in as blame. And I just want to add that at Peace at Home, we see problem solving as a very important child skill. And we have a whole class that helps you learn to coach problem solving. Because when kids perceive that they can solve problems, they're much safer in adolescence. They're less likely to be overly influenced by their peers. They're more likely to have a little more independence of that. If you keep solving all their problems, once they become teenagers, they turn from you to their peers to solve their problems. And that is a roll of the dice. So this coaching problem solving is a very important part of what we do here at Peace at Home.
And the last thing I want to say before we leave that slide is that I think we cannot try to change behaviors unless we first understand them. And so we need to recognize that very often aggression, non-compliance, meltdowns are a child's way of communicating. And we need to try to understand what the child is trying to communicate to us before we can begin to ask them to change it. Okay, so I will try to go on. When we can talk about different kinds of difficulties that children might present, but I think one of the things that is common to many approaches is that we need to help children learn to tolerate a little bit of distress. As parents, we need to learn to tolerate a little bit of distress. When we think about anxiety, for example, typically when people are anxious, they avoid the source of their anxiety. That means they will never have an opportunity to address the source of their anxiety. So we have to teach children how to cope with some of that anxiety and then expose them to the source of their anxiety. And I think often as parents, we want to protect them from that, but that's really not the most helpful thing we can do. And it's hard for parents. It means that we have to learn how to tolerate our anxiety and the child's discomfort. So we want to be a coach and a cheerleader for these children and teach them some new coping strategies. But we also want to say to them, I think you can do this. I know it's hard, it's scary, but I know that you can do it. So I think we are asking parents to learn some of those skills, how to be a calm, supportive coach who does not take over, but supports the child's decision-making process and problem-solving skills.
And I just want to add about that calm coach. Right now, because there's a pediatric mental health crisis going on, what the research is telling us is that our first focus as parents will ideally be triggering calm in our kids. Now, this requires us to know when our brains are activated, when our bodies are activated and in a fear state, and even in an unconscious fear state, and learning how to calm our own brains. And when you're thinking about, you walk into your kid's room and they're playing Dungeons and Dragons instead of doing their homework, your brain might perceive that that's dangerous, that this child's going to be living in my basement for the rest of their lives. And we as parents perceive danger all the time that isn't there. And even if it is danger, if we don't know how to calm our brains, we're not going to be helpful. But in terms of protecting your child's mental health, regardless of what their diagnoses are, one of the most important, or not having any diagnoses, one of the best ways to protect your child's mental health is to always ask yourself, is what I'm about to do going to trigger calm or stress in my child? There's nothing more important right now. There's your attachment and there's calm. Yes. And spending time with your kid, enjoying them, taking delight in them and having joy in your life. You know, kids look to your face to see the world. And if you're walking around with the list of things to do in your head all the time, and you're looking stressed, and you're not taking delight in walking outside and feeling the rain on your face ever, they're going to think that life is about a stressful experience. And this calm, joyful connection is one of the most therapeutic things you can do. Sorry, I got carried away, Marianne.
That's okay. So I think we've started to talk about some of these things. It's very important to think about changing your understanding of your child's behavior. I mean, I have had my moments when I thought my kids were just trying to infuriate me, and they can do it if they work at it. That's never the case. They are struggling to manage something on their own, and I need to manage my own response to that. They are communicating something to me that I need to be able to step back and understand. So I think we all want to reflect on our response to their behavior. I also think most people that I have worked with in therapy find themselves at one point or another doing that thing that their parents did that they thought they would never do. And I put myself in that group too. When we are highly stressed, we go into automatic responses, and that's okay. We're human beings. None of us are perfect, but I do think we want to develop the skills to reflect on those skills and to be a little bit more intentional about the way we respond to what our children present. I think most therapy will invite parents to reflect on their own history as a child, on the ways that they were parented, the messages that they got. You know, is it safe to talk about feelings, or is that something that we do not go near, that, we just tough it out and manage things on our own? Those are our subtle messages that are conveyed in families that influence us as we grow into adults and create new families. So I think it's important that we are able to sort some of those out. And as I mentioned earlier, without using the word triggered, I do think we get triggered by certain interactions that impel us to go into automatic fight or flight mode and respond in ways that have been modeled for us. And we just want to be thoughtful and attentive about that.
I'm really watching this intergenerationally because my daughter is telling me that her daughter sounds just like me at my worst when her daughter's upset. And so I'm sure that makes it 3 times as hard for my daughter to respond in a loving, calm way. Any questions or comments about your role and how you're engaging there? Someone mentioned the Gottman emotion coaching. And yes, this is consistent with Gottman's emotion coaching, but when we're teaching you emotions coaching, it's also coaching problem solving specifically. So it's a slightly different twist, but Gottman's emotion coaching really helps you. It gives you tools to listen to emotions. I'm just going to quickly, we're going to start to run out of time here, but I'm going to catch this question really quickly. Mary, why don't you go ahead?
I'm sorry.
We have someone has their hand raised, and I'm trying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I wanted extra help with basically with when my child does stuff when asked, or basically having a calm, like y'all said, a calm type of attitude, because I tend to yell a lot, and I want to get out of it because I'm tired of it, and it's not.
It's very difficult, and we do have some classes on brain calming practices for parents. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
So, how do you know if therapy is working? It's important for you to feel like the therapist really gets you. They get what's important to you. They get what's important to your kid. It's important that your therapist is listening to your perceptions about your child. You know your child well from a certain point of view. And it's important that the therapist hears you, that they don't just tell you their theory, but that together you're building an understanding of the child. And you need to have a therapist that feels like they're being helpful, but also give you hope. Right now, therapists are swamped. We can't keep up with the demand for children's therapists, and people are trying to recruit new children's therapists. We just don't have enough therapists. And your therapist may be getting burned out, and they may be giving you messages of despair that they're feeling from being overwhelmed. trust that and talk to the therapist about it. Just say, are you optimistic that my child can improve? And, if not, why not? Make sure that the therapist respects you and your family and your child and your culture. If you feel hurt or misunderstood by the therapist, speak about it, give words to it, and describe it to the therapist. That's really important. And make sure they're engaging with you in the process one way or another, that you feel welcomed when you reach out to them, and that they are regularly keeping you, informed. You want to make sure that you feel free to ask questions or raise those kinds of concerns. You want to feel confident that the therapist will take your concerns seriously, and you need to be seeing progress. Even in early stages, you need to see something that's going in a positive direction, and accept the fact that you may see progress and then all of a sudden you have a few steps back, either in your own behavior or in your child's presentations of behavior. And that's part of human growth. We take a few steps forward, then we go back, and we take a few steps forward. But you do want to be seeing progress over time. And if not, you want to talk very clearly with the therapist about that. And you might want to be looking at your goals from time to time, because the goals may have become outdated, or the goals may have been reached. Very often parents just keep taking kids to therapy, and therapists aren't always responsible about going back to the goals. And I will do that in my own practice. I work with adults, but I will say, you've really reached your goals. Now we can keep working together as you integrate this and you feel more confident about your goals, but the therapist should be responsible about helping you identify this. But you have to report to the therapist what's going on in order for the therapist to know. But understand that there's nothing valuable in keeping your kid in therapy when there isn't any need for it, and understanding there may be a time to end, or something else may have evolved in the treatment process, and you may decide we have a new goal that we're going to work towards, but don't do this forever. And if it feels to you like the therapy really isn't working, the child is going week after week after week, and the same problems are happening, it's been going on for 3 or 4 months, talk to your referral sources, talk to school professionals, medical professionals, other parents, and ask around about therapists. Meet with the therapist and tell them that this is my perception. This is what I'm seeing. Can you help me understand what I should expect? Is this going to get better? Think about going to parent support groups for yourself, so that, going to parenting classes or parenting support groups, so that you're working on your end as actively as you can. Because really, parents are the most powerful mental health intervention we have for children. So you changing your approaches, you understanding your child better, you thinking about how you want to interact with the child is far more powerful than anything a therapist can do in the office with your child. And you may want to think about, maybe we need to do family therapy, or maybe we need something more specialized. Maybe if my child has had some serious trauma, we want to try a trauma treatment like EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. But, you may want to try a new approach, and you're going to have to talk to a lot of people to figure that out. Anything else about that, Marianne, that I didn't?
No, we do have a question, though, about how about if a teenager wants to continue going to therapy? I think that's an important consideration. I think sometimes teenagers just appreciate having a kind and attentive adult who is not a parent to discuss some of the things that are happening in their lives. And that may be slightly less goal focused, but I think it's a useful thing to do perhaps for a time limited period of time. I think if we have, a teenager saying to us, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to an adult about how I'm feeling, that's very valuable, and we should honor that.
Absolutely. And it's a great sign that they trust their therapist, and you have to make sure you trust the therapist. If my child said they wanted to keep seeing the therapist and there weren't any particular goals, I would want to meet with the child and the therapist, and I would just want to understand. So, help me understand, how will we know, when this is done, what kinds of things might you be doing going forward, just so you understand the nature of the therapy. But adolescence is such a complicated time for kids, and so confusing to parents. it's a great sign that your kid wants to be reflective and have a grown-up in their lives, because otherwise they're turning to their peers, and that isn't always ideal, although they need relationships with their peers to grow and develop in a healthy way. Any other questions or comments? That was a great question. So we're going to wrap up soon. And I want to say that Marian and I will be staying on after the class is over in case there's some questions you want to ask that you don't want included in the recording. But before that, we have a little information to share with you. But tell us, what's going to be your first action step? Are you just exploring, and right now you need to talk to some people about finding a therapist? Are you thinking that now I need to talk to my child's therapist and ask a few more questions? Are you thinking about setting goals and having those indicators of progress with the therapist and the child, even if they're already in therapy? Maybe you want to talk with the therapist about your role in the therapy process. Many child therapists don't effectively engage parents, don't give you new strategies and ideas, and you want to ask about that. And maybe you have another idea from our conversation, and please put that into the chat if you'd be willing. So we'll give you another minute or two so we can see everybody. So it looks like about almost half of us have a different idea for your first action step. I will love if you put it into the chat. About a third of us are going to set goals and progress indicators with your child's therapist and your child. A few of you are going to start talking with people about these, about finding a therapist. And some of us are going to, a small number of people will be talking with a therapist about your role. Don't be shy about that. And Peace at Home Parenting has several classes about parents' roles in treatment, in addition to this one, and parents' roles in protecting children's mental health. Don't hesitate to email us again at solutions@peaceathomeparenting.com and ask us about some of these follow-up classes. So quick reminders. Kids may need therapy if their difficulties are lasting more than a few weeks, that your efforts to help isn't helping, or if it's happening in more than one setting or affecting their normal activities. You want to look for therapists that are effective at addressing this particular challenge and have experience, that are licensed, use evidence-based approaches, and respect your culture and point of view and that of your child. You want to be sure to feel comfortable asking questions and feel like the therapist listens to you and your child. Expect the therapist to explain their approach with your kid. Make sure you're setting goals and steps in progress, and start with the idea with your child that this isn't a negative response, but you're seeking help together. And expect that your child may be learning new approaches, and your job is to be a calm coach and celebrate progress. And if therapy is not reducing the problem, think about talking to the therapist or seeking a different treatment. And if goals are met, think about it might be time to end the therapy unless the child really wants to continue, and just try to understand that. And expect that you and perhaps your beliefs or approaches may change in this process. Before we go, I see that. So we have a parent whose children are too young for therapy, but that parent is open to their kids using therapy in the future. And I feel happy that we're kind of normalizing this for you, and it can just be seen as, we take our kids to the doctor when they have a sore throat, and we see a therapist when they're overwhelmed with emotional challenges. Everybody on this class and everyone who registered will be receiving a follow-up email with the link to the recording of this whole class. So if you came in late, you'll be able to watch the whole thing. If you want to share it with a partner or someone important in your child's life, you can watch it together, or you can send the link to them. You're also going to be receiving some handouts that highlight the important points from the class. And if you're feeling like you need more from here, sign up for one of our other live classes. There's many of them throughout the month. I will be hosting a Q&A session, a question and answer session every month, and we often have guests at those sessions. If we can't answer your question in that Q&A session, we're going to post the answer in our private monitored Facebook group. You can join that group. It's over 1,500 professionals and parents. and folks ask questions and share successes, and we share resources there. It's a very evolved, wonderful group of parents and professionals. And at Peace at Home Parenting, any of our teachers are available for one-on-one private consultations. And again, you can email us about anything at solutions@peaceathomeparenting.com. And let's see. Mary Ann, do you have any last comments before we go?
I don't think so.
I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Mary Ann for bringing her world of experience from the University of Connecticut Psychological Services Clinic and all the graduate students that you work with, Mary Ann. And I want to thank you all for your questions and comments and sharing your experiences with us. I'm going to end the recording and we'll stay on for a few minutes in case there's any last questions. Thanks for being here, everybody.